She wasn't supposed to be the one carrying a rifle. The Navy had trained her to stitch wounds, stop bleeding, and bring dying men back from the edge of darkness. Her hands were crafted for healing, not killing. Yet even among warriors, people whispered that she had something different about her. Some called it steel. Others called it grace. But those who knew her best, the SEALs who fought beside her, would later call it fury. From the first day she joined the unit as their medic, she felt the weight of skepticism. SEALs were the Navy's blunt edge, men sharpened by endless tests of endurance and combat skill. They lived in a world where weakness meant death, and outsiders, no matter how qualified, had to prove themselves. She was an outsider in every sense. Not only was she a medic, she was smaller, quieter, and her role was to protect, not to destroy. At first, the team treated her with polite detachment. They trusted her with gauze and syringes, but not yet with their lives. She understood. It even respected it. Trust in their world wasn't granted with a uniform or a title. It was earned drop by drop, through sweat and pain and days when quitting would be the easiest option. She never quit. In training, she ran until her lungs burned, refusing to be left behind. She carried packs heavier than her own body weight, stumbling under the load, but rising again each time. When the men left, testing her resolve, she only answered with silence and another push-up, another lap, another repetition, until laughter gave way to respect. They started calling her Doc, not as a nickname, but as a sign she belonged. Still, in their eyes she was the calm in the storm, the one who would kneel in blood-soaked dirt to stitch a torn artery, not the one to take the fight to the enemy. And perhaps that suited her at first. Healing gave her purpose. Saving lives mattered more to her than ending them. But she was not naive. She knew what war required. On long nights after training, when the others collapsed into sleep, she stayed awake, studying manuals, field guides, and ballistics charts. She visited the range alone, practicing until her shoulders ached and her fingers blistered. Each shot cracked into the silence with surgical precision, her breathing steady, her focus unshaken. She never boasted, never asked for recognition. The quiet hours were her own, a private vow that she would never be helpless when the team needed her most. By the time deployment orders came, she had already accepted her reality. She was not there to be a hero. She was there to keep heroes alive, and if fate demanded more of her, she was prepared, though she never spoke of it aloud. The desert was unforgiving. Heat radiated from the earth, swallowing every drop of sweat before it could cool her skin. Dust coated her throat, turning each breath to grit. She carried her pack with the precision of ritual. Trauma kits, bandages, vials of morphine, surgical tools, and the burden of responsibility no lighter than the sand beneath her boots. Around her, the SEALs moved like shadows, weapons cradled, in hands that never trembled, eyes sharp and unyielding. They had grown used to her presence, even protective of it. Some teased her, calling her the heart of the unit. Others, less willing to admit sentiment, showed their respect in silence, an extra canteen tucked into her pack, a seat offered on the rare moments of rest. She never mistook these gestures for pity. In their language of hardship, such gestures meant she was one of them. Still, there was a barrier no kindness could erase. She was a medic. They were warriors. In battle, she would kneel in the dirt with a wounded man while the rest pressed forward, rifles blazing. Her fight was different. One measured in tourniquets instead of bullets. She told herself she was fine with that. And perhaps she was, until the day came when war decided otherwise. The valley loomed ahead, carved by centuries of wind and time. Jagged cliffs rose on either side, offering cover to anyone patient enough to wait in silence. The mission was straightforward: gather intelligence, disrupt supply lines, and return before the enemy could mount a response. But war had a way of mocking plans, twisting simplicity into chaos in the space of a heartbeat. As the SEALs advanced, she walked in silence, scanning the ridges out of habit. Something about the stillness gnawed at her instincts. Her pack felt heavier than usual, straps digging into her shoulders. She ignored it, forcing her breathing steady. She had one job: keep the team alive. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she felt the coiled tension of a bowstring pulled too tight. She didn't know then that within moments, her world would shift. That the hands trained to heal would prove equally capable of destruction. That fury, long buried beneath her calm exterior, would erupt with a force the SEALs would never forget. The blast came first, a thunderclap of fire and stone ripping the air apart. She dropped instinctively, ears ringing, dust filling her lungs. Shouts echoed, urgent and sharp. Bullets rained from the cliffs, sparking against rocks, tearing into dirt, biting into flesh. Her first thought wasn't of herself. It never was. She scrambled toward the nearest cry, dragging a wounded man behind cover, blood pouring between her fingers. Training took over tourniquet, pressure, calm voice in the chaos. She didn't flinch when another explosion shook the earth. She didn't freeze when rounds cracked overhead. Saving lives was her battlefield, and she fought it without hesitation. But then her eyes lifted, scanning the ridge, and she saw it, the glint of sunlight on glass, the telltale shimmer of a sniper's nest. Her breath caught, heart pounding. Every second that sniper remained, another SEAL could fall. Her role was to heal, but healing would mean nothing if they all died here. In that instant, something inside her shifted. She slid beside a fallen SEAL, fingers wrapping around the cold steel of his rifle. It felt heavy, foreign, and familiar all at once. She had practiced for this moment in silence, never expecting it to arrive. Now it was here. The men saw her, stunned but desperate. Number 1 stopped her. No one had time to. She inhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat, and through the scope, she found the glint again. Her finger curled around the trigger. Every ounce of hesitation burned away. She was still the medic. She was still the one who healed. But in that second, she was also something else. Something the SEALs would speak of for years to come. Rifle cracked. The sniper fell. And the fury within her was only beginning to rise. Trust in a SEAL team was never given freely. It was carved out of hardship, tested under exhaustion, and proven in the smallest of moments when quitting seemed easier than pressing forward. For her, that trust began not on the battlefield, but in the long grinding days of training that blurred together into a haze of sweat, mud, and silence. They called her Doc because of her role, but at first it was said almost with a boundary in place, as though the word reminded them she was separate from their world of breachers, snipers, and assault specialists. A medic was essential, yes, but never the tip of the spear. To her, the title was both a comfort and a challenge. Comfort, because she had earned her place with a skill no one else could provide. Challenge, because it always hinted at the unspoken question. Could she keep up when the burden was more than medical? Day after day, she answered that question without speaking a word. When the men ran drills carrying 100-pound logs across sand, she didn't complain about her size or strength. She shouldered the weight, her muscles trembling but her jaw set with iron resolve. When their packs weighed them down during ruck marches, she strapped hers tight and marched without falling behind. The smallest stumble, the faintest sign of weakness, would have been magnified under their eyes. She refused to give them that chance, and slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to notice. It wasn't just physical grit that won them over, it was her silence. She didn't brag when she finished a run ahead of one of them. She didn't gloat when she lifted herself over walls, Some assumed she couldn't climb. She only nodded, caught her breath, and prepared for the next challenge. Her discipline was steady, the kind of quiet strength warriors respected even if they didn't speak of it. There were nights when exhaustion hung over the team like a fog, when men collapsed in the dirt after hours of drills. She, too, would be drained to her core. But while others drifted into restless sleep, she often remained awake, sitting cross-legged with a rifle across her lap or studying field manuals under a faint light. More than one SEAL passed her tent and saw her hunched over a page of anatomy sketches or ballistics charts, lips moving silently as she memorized. They didn't say anything, but they noticed. Her dual devotion to medicine and to mastery made them reassess who she was. One night after a punishing training cycle, one of the team's snipers, a man known for his stoic demeanor, dropped onto the sand beside her. He didn't say much, just handed her a canteen. "Staying sharp?" he asked, watching her clean a rifle with deliberate precision. She smiled faintly and nodded. That was enough. In their world, words weren't needed. Presence was. A bond grew deeper during deployment. In the dust-choked villages where they operated, the SEALs depended on her as much for morale as for medicine. She didn't just patch wounds. She listened. She calmed nerves when missions dragged on and exhaustion bred mistakes. Her voice was steady, even when her own fear nipped at her ribs. And when injuries came, as they always did, she worked with such calm efficiency that the team began to see her differently. She wasn't just Doc, she was family. During long patrols, conversations shifted. They asked about her life. Before the Navy, her reasons for choosing medicine. She never gave dramatic answers, only simple truths that saving lives mattered more to her than anything else, that she couldn't imagine standing aside while others fought and bled. They respected that. Some of the hardest men in the unit, men who rarely opened up, found themselves confiding in her during late-night watches. She became a confidant as much as a protector, her presence steady in a way that made the harshness of deployment easier to bear. And yet, despite this closeness, there remained something about her that none of them fully understood. She wasn't reckless, but she was relentless. When others rested, she trained. When others joked, she studied. When others drank during downtime, she polished her gear. They teased her for it, but beneath the jokes was a dawning realization. She was preparing for something more than her designated role. She carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone waiting for a test unseen. It was during a live fire exercise that the first hints of her hidden skill emerged. The team moved through a mock village, weapons barking as they cleared rooms. Her job was to trail behind, treating casualties and practicing triage under simulated fire. But when one of the instructors shouted, "Sniper, second floor, window right," she didn't duck behind cover like the others expected. Instead, she dropped to a knee, raised the practice rifle she had been given, and fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The instructors called it a clean hit. The men looked at each other, eyebrows raised. She only shrugged and went back to treating her dummy patient as though nothing unusual had happened. No one laughed at her after that. Her precision remained unspoken but unforgettable. The SEALs didn't confront her about it. They didn't need to. In their line of work, men respected what was proven more than what was said. And she had proven she was more than a medic. Trust hardened further during a mission gone wrong on deployment. A roadside bomb had flicked their convoy, scattering the team across burning sand. Smoke and screams filled the air. She was out of her vehicle before anyone else, sprinting through fire to reach a man pinned beneath twisted metal. With strength born of adrenaline, she dragged him free, tore away his shredded vest, and began working on his wounds while bullets cracked in. The distance She didn't flinch when rounds struck dangerously close. She stayed focused until the bleeding slowed, until he was stable enough to be carried. Only then did she grab her rifle, covering the retreat with bursts of fire. Later that night, when the team sat in grim silence, she patched the last of the burns on her own arms without complaint. They watched her quietly. For the first time, no one saw just a medic. They saw one of their own unshakable, unbreakable, forged by the same fire that forged them. Respect, once cautious, had become unshakable trust. They didn't call her Doc anymore with boundaries. They called her Doc with pride, the way brothers spoke a name that meant survival. She had earned her place, not by pretending to be like them, but by proving she was strong in her own right. And yet, none of them knew how far her resolve could reach. None of them knew she had prepared herself in silence for the moment when medicine would not be enough. That moment was coming. It would arrive in a valley of stone and dust, where the air itself would burn with gunfire, where the line between healer and warrior would vanish in seconds. When it did, the SEALs would never again speak of her in the same way. They would carry her memory with words spoken like scripture. You'll never forget her fury. But for now, in these days of trust, earned through sweat and silence, she was still just their medic, still just Doc, still waiting for the test fate was already preparing. The mission looked straightforward on paper, as most did. Enter a valley stronghold. Gather intelligence from a suspected supply cache. Disrupt whatever enemy logistics they uncovered. Return before the enemy had time to mount a coordinated response. To the brass in command tents, it was just another tick on the endless list of operations. To the SEALs moving into the mountains, it was another knife-edge gamble, where life and death balanced on timing, instinct, and the strength of the team beside them. For her, it was a test she hadn't asked for, but knew was coming. They had been briefed in silence, maps spread across tables under flickering lamps, fingers tracing routes, red markers circling possible choke points. The intel suggested light resistance, maybe a handful of fighters guarding crates. Nothing unusual, nothing compared to operations they had carried out dozens of times before. Still, the men prepared as though they would be walking into the gates of hell itself. She had learned from them. Underestimate nothing. Expect everything. The valley was a scar carved deep into the earth, narrow trails threading through jagged cliffs that loomed like watchtowers. The kind of terrain that looked beautiful from a distance, but felt sinister up close. Shadows clung to crevices, and every rock seemed sharp enough to cut. From the moment they stepped onto that path, she felt the weight of silence pressing in. Her pack bit into her shoulders. She shifted its straps, but said nothing. Inside, every item was meticulously arranged: bandages, tourniquets, 4 kits, morphine injectors, a compact defibrillator, even tools for emergency surgery. Each piece represented life in the face of destruction, but together they weighed as heavy as the lives they might have to save. She moved near the rear, as was her place, her eyes scanning constantly. The SEALs at the front advanced with rifles raised, boots crunching gravel with measured rhythm. Their heads pivoted like predators, every sound dissected, every shadow weighed. She mirrored their vigilance. Even if her job wasn't to spot ambushes, it was impossible not to. The further they pushed, the more uneasy she felt. Something about the valley gnawed at her instincts. The silence was too complete, too deliberate. No birds wheeled overhead. No insects buzzed in the sun. Even the wind seemed to avoid the canyon floor, leaving the air heavy, still expectant. She had walked into danger enough times to recognize when nature itself seemed to be holding its breath. One of the SEALs, a grizzled veteran with eyes like flint, fell back to walk beside her. He didn't speak at first, just studied her posture. Pack too heavy? he finally asked, his voice low. She shook her head. Feels normal. He gave a short nod. It wasn't concern he had asked, with it was respect. These men carried their own burdens, and knew when someone else was shouldering more than their share. That was the closest thing to care they allowed themselves in the field. They pressed on. By midday, sweat stung her eyes, dust coated her throat, and her legs burned from the climb. But her mind was sharper than ever. She catalogued every rock face, every ledge where a shooter might hide. She wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. The SEALs had drilled her into understanding that safety was a myth and survival belonged to those who anticipated betrayal in every shadow. She tightened her grip on her pack straps, fingers brushing the sidearm holstered at her hip. She carried it more as a regulation than a weapon, but its presence was oddly comforting. She reminded herself that she was there to save, not fight, and yet she had trained for more, in silence and darkness, when no one was watching. The path narrowed until the cliffs pressed so close they seemed to breathe down their necks. Sunlight slanted in harsh shafts, leaving alternating bands of brightness and shadow across the trail. Every step echoed strangely, bouncing back in ways that made it impossible to tell where sounds originated. The point man raised a clenched fist, halting the team. The valley ahead dipped into a bowl-shaped clearing, littered with boulders. Too many places to hide, too quiet. The SEALs fanned out, taking cover, weapons angled at every crevice. She crouched instinctively, heart thudding. Minutes dragged, nothing moved. The team leader gave the signal, and they began crossing the clearing one by one. She waited her turn, crouched low, scanning the ridges. Her stomach twisted. The air felt wrong, heavy, like the second before lightning split the sky. Her mind replayed the briefings, the assurances that enemy numbers would be small, that this was routine. But war never cared about reports. War had its own cruel script. When her turn came, she darted across the open ground, her boots kicking up dust, eyes sweeping the cliffs. She felt exposed, as though unseen eyes traced her every step. She clutched her pack tighter, forcing herself forward, refusing to falter. On the far side, the SEAL who had crossed before her gave a quick hand sign. Almost there. She inhaled, tried to calm her racing pulse. Then the world erupted. The explosion came from above, a shattering roar that flung rocks into the air. Dust billowed, choking, blinding. Gunfire followed instantly, pouring down from hidden nests carved into the cliffs. Bullets tore into the dirt, sparked against stone, screamed past their ears. Shouts filled the air orders, curses, cries of pain. Her instincts jolted her forward, throwing her down behind a slab of rock as the SEALs returned fire. She could hear the distinct crack of rifles, the rattle of machine guns, the sharp ping of rounds striking far too close. Her hands shook once, briefly, then steadied. She knew her place. Medic. Someone shouted, voice raw with pain. She was already moving, crawling low, dragging her kit from her pack. Dust stung her eyes, but her focus narrowed to the wounded man slumped against a rock, blood pouring from his thigh. She tore open his pant leg, clamped a tourniquet high and tight, twisted until the bleeding slowed. Bullets snapped overhead, one striking so close it sprayed rock fragments across her arms. She didn't flinch. Stay with me, she told the SEAL, voice calm, as though chaos weren't roaring all around them. Her tone steadied him, kept him from slipping into panic. Another shout. Another man down. She moved again, crawling through dirt, bullets chasing her. Her pack felt impossibly heavy now, but she ignored the pain. Each second mattered. Each drop of blood meant the difference between life and death. And all the while, in the back of Her mind something stirred. That coiled, silent tension she had carried for months. The hours of training no one had seen. The vow she had made that she would never be helpless when her team needed her most. She wasn't there yet. But she felt it coming. The battle had only just begun. The valley exploded into madness. Rocks split under gunfire. Dust choked the air, and the earth itself seemed to shake beneath the violence. The SEALs scrambled into cover, weapons hammering back at the unseen enemy above, their shouts blending with the deafening rhythm of battle. She crouched low behind a jagged slab, heart thundering, ears ringing, her mind already shifting into the practiced rhythm of combat medicine. "Medic!" The cry cut through the chaos like a blade. She was moving before the word finished. Crawling, sliding, her kit already in her hands. The wounded SEAL lay half hidden in the dirt, blood spilling from his shoulder where a round had torn through flesh. She dropped beside him, her body shielding his as best she could, bullets cracking against stone inches away. "Stay still," she said, her voice calm, steady, as though they weren't in the middle of a storm. Her hands worked with the efficiency of training. Gauze pressed deep, bandage wrapped tight, tourniquet applied high on the arm to cut off the bleeding. The man groaned, his breath hitching in pain, but his eyes locked on hers. Her calm steadied. Him. Another explosion rocked the valley, flinging dust and fragments into the air. Shrapnel rattled against her pack, stung her neck. She didn't flinch. She kept her hands moving. "Doc, we're pinned." Someone shouted from behind cover. She knew. She could feel it. Enemy fire rained from every angle, hammering them down, cutting off movement. The SEALs were trapped, forced into a deadly standstill. "Next one's hit," another voice yelled. She pressed the first patient's hand against his bandage and sprinted low, her boots pounding the dirt. Bullets whipped past. One close enough, she felt the wind of it kiss her cheek. She dropped beside the second casualty, blood darkening his thigh where a round had torn muscle. He gritted his teeth, trying to sit up. "Don't move," she ordered, shoving him down with surprising strength. She ripped open her kit, applied pressure, slipped a tourniquet high above the wound, and twisted until the bleeding slowed. He swore under his breath, but she only said, "Good, stay angry. That means you're alive." Gunfire raged above, the SEALs firing back in controlled bursts, but they were suppressed. The enemy had the high ground, multiple firing points raining fire down on them. She could hear the metallic ping of rounds ricocheting off rocks. Bien? Occasional grunt as a man ducked a fraction too late. Her mind split itself in two. One part remained fully medic, focused on bandages, blood flow, airways. The other part tracked the battle, scanning the ridges between quick glances at her patients. She wasn't a rifleman. She wasn't supposed to be. But her instinct screamed that something had to change. Another cry, "Doc!" She darted again, her lungs burning, dust filling her throat. A third SEAL was slumped against a boulder, clutching. His chest. Blood oozed through his fingers. She shoved his hand aside, pressed hard, and tore open her trauma pack. Every move was deliberate. She could feel fear clawing at her chest, but she forced it down, burying it under training. "You're fine. Look at me." "You're fine," she said, even as she slipped a needle into his chest to release the trapped air from a sucking wound. His breath rattled, then steadied. Around her, chaos reigned. The SEALs fired upward, but the enemy had the advantage. They couldn't see the shooters clearly through the haze of dust and muzzle flashes. The cliff faces became death traps, every shadow spitting fire. One of the team leaders dropped beside her between bursts of gunfire. "We can't move," he barked, sweat streaking down his dirt-smeared face. She knew she didn't need to. Be told. Another bullet struck so close that shards of rock sliced her arm. Blood trickled down her sleeve, but she ignored it. She sealed another wound, stabilized another man, moved to the next. Her world narrowed into a cycle. Crawl, treat, reassure, repeat. The fury building inside her had no outlet yet. But the moment was drawing closer. Through the dust, her eyes caught it, the faint shimmer of glass on the ridge, sunlight glinting off a scope. A sniper's nest. She froze, her pulse spiking. She had seen it before anyone else. Her stomach twisted. If he fired again, one of the men might not get back up. She swallowed hard, forcing herself back to her patient. This was her job. Save lives, not take them. That was what she had been trained for. That was what she had sworn. Yet, as she pressed bandages into place, her mind replayed those countless nights alone on the range. The hours spent training in silence, preparing for a moment like this. She had always known, deep down, that someday medicine wouldn't be enough. That someday she would have to decide between healing and fighting. The decision wasn't here yet, but she could feel it closing in, a shadow moving closer with every bullet. Another shout split the air. Another man went down. Her hands worked automatically, but her eyes kept flicking upward, back to that shimmer of glass on the ridge. The sniper was patient, methodical, waiting for the perfect shot. He wasn't spraying fire like the others. He was choosing targets. And if she didn't stop him, she shook the thought away, biting it down. Not yet. Still, her hands trembled faintly as she tied off a bandage. She clenched them into fists, forcing the tremor away. The SEALs kept fighting, their shouts a mixture of fury and control. They trusted her to keep them alive. And she was doing it. But for how long? A grenade exploded nearby, the shockwaves slamming her into the dirt. Ears ringing, vision blurred, she blinked through the dust. The patient beside her was groaning, blood soaking into the earth. She forced herself upright, hands shaking only. For a moment before steadying again, she tore open a fresh bandage, pressed it down, wrapped it tight. "You're fine," she whispered, more to herself than to him. And then she looked up again, past the dust, past the chaos. The sniper's glint was still there, watching, waiting. Her chest tightened. She could feel it. The line between medic and fighter was thinning, fraying with every passing second. Soon, it would snap. But for now, she pressed another bandage into place, crawled to the next man, and told herself the same lie she had repeated since the first explosion. "I'm only here to heal," even as the fury in her blood whispered otherwise. The battlefield had narrowed into two truths. She could not save them all, and the enemy would not stop until none of them were left breathing. Her hands were slick with blood, some her own, most not. Her kit was scattered, wrappers torn, bandages used, morphine injectors tossed aside. She crawled from man to man, dragging herself through dust and grit, stitching wounds, sealing arteries, whispering encouragements that carried more weight than the bullets snapping overhead. But her eyes kept drifting upward, drawn back to that glint of glass on the ridge. The sniper, patient, deliberate, and merciless. Every crack of his rifle sent another SEAL scrambling for cover or collapsing into her arms. The others fought, back, spraying fire into the cliffs, but they couldn't pin him down. He had the high ground, the concealment, the time. Each shot he took was another wound she would have to try to close, another life slipping further out of her reach. Her fury coiled tighter with every passing second. When another cry split the chaos, "Man down!" she was already moving. She slid into the dirt beside the fallen SEAL, blood soaking through his vest. The entry wound was small but deep, a sniper's mark. Her stomach twisted as she clamped her hands over it, But even as she worked, her gaze snapped upward again. The glint was still there. The rifleman hadn't moved. Why should he? He owned this valley. She swallowed hard. Her heart pounded so. Loud it drowned out the gunfire. She had sworn to be a healer. That oath was carved into her very bones. Yet what use was healing if death kept tearing through them faster than she could stop it? Her patient groaned, dragging her attention back. She pressed harder, whispering, "Stay with me." Her voice was steady, but her mind screamed with conflict. Her hands were saving one man, while her eyes tracked the invisible killer lining up his next victim. And then she saw it, another muzzle flash, another bullet's path cutting the air, another seal thrown to the ground. Something inside her snapped. She had practiced for this in silence, prepared for a day she hoped would never come. Hours on the range, countless nights spent honing skills no one knew she had. She hadn't done it for recognition. She hadn't done it to prove anything. She had done it for this moment, a moment when medicine wouldn't be enough. Her decision came not with hesitation, but with clarity. She glanced at the man she had just stabilized, pressed his hand against the bandage. "Hold this," she ordered. He nodded, grimacing, but obeyed. And she crawled toward the fallen seal a few feet. Away, the one whose rifle lay beside him, half buried in dust. Her fingers closed around the weapon, cold steel biting into her palms. It was heavier than her sidearm, heavier than the weight of her kit. But it felt right, as though it had been waiting for her all along. The seals closest to her saw it happen. Their eyes widened, but no one shouted for her to stop. Maybe they were too shocked. Maybe they understood. She dropped to her stomach, propped the rifle on a rock, and slid the scope to her eye. The world shrank. The chaos of the valley blurred into silence. Her breath steadied, her hands stilled. Through the scope, the sniper's nest came into focus, just a shadowed ridge. A figure barely visible, rifle glinting in the sun. He was lining up his next shot, oblivious to her. Her heartbeat slowed. One breath in, one breath out. Her finger curled around the trigger. She thought of the men bleeding behind her, of the lives she could not save if she allowed another bullet to fly. She thought of every hour she had spent preparing, alone, unseen, promising herself she would never be helpless. And she thought of the oath she had sworn to heal. But even oaths bend when survival demands it. The rifle cracked. The figure on the ridge jerked, collapsed. A glint of glass vanished. For a second, the world held still. Then the valley erupted again, enemy fire pouring down from other positions. But the sniper, their deadliest threat, was gone. She had taken him. Her chest heaved. She blinked through the scope, scanning for movement. Another figure appeared, scrambling too. Shift into the sniper's position. Her hands didn't hesitate. Another breath, another squeeze. Another body crumpled. "Holy hell," one of the seals muttered from nearby, eyes wide with disbelief. She ignored him. She wasn't doing this for all. She was doing it because she had no choice. Shot after shot rang out, each one precise, deliberate, measured. Her fury wasn't wild. It was cold, controlled. Every round was vengeance for the blood on her hands, protection for the brothers who had trusted her with their lives. The steady calm that once guided her scalpel now guided her trigger finger. The seals around her shifted, emboldened. With the sniper threat neutralized, they could maneuver, push back, fight with renewed strength. But even as they advanced, they kept glancing at her. The medic, their doc, the woman they had known for saving lives, was now ending them with terrifying precision. She didn't notice their stares. Through the scope, the battle became simple. Targets appeared. Targets fell. Her breathing never faltered. Her heart never wavered. Each shot was a promise. You will not take them. Not while I am here. When her magazine clicked empty, she ejected it, reloaded with the speed of someone who had practiced this countless times in secret. Dust stung her eyes, blood caked her hands, but her focus was unbreakable. Another figure, another breath, another shot. By the time she lowered the rifle, the battlefield had changed. The enemy's fire had thinned, their positions broken, their momentum shattered. The SEALs pressed forward, clearing the cliffs with ruthless efficiency. What had seemed like certain death minutes ago was now a fight they could win. She sat back, chest rising and falling, rifle resting across her lap. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. The fury that had driven her was still there, simmering, but beneath it was something else. Relief. A shadow fell across her. One of the SEALs crouched beside her, eyes burning with something between awe and disbelief. "Doc," he said, voice rough, "where the hell did that come from?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Words felt meaningless in the face of what had just happened. Instead, she pushed herself up, slung her rifle, and crawled back to her patients. There were still wounds to treat, blood to stop, lives to save. She was still the medic. That hadn't changed. But as she knelt beside the next man, pressing her hands back into their familiar rhythm of healing, she felt the weight of the rifle across her back. She had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew the SEALs would never look at her the same way again. The echo of her first kills still lingered in the valley, a ghostly reminder of the line she had crossed. The rifle lay against her shoulder as though it belonged there, yet every time her hands brushed the weapon's cold frame, she was reminded of the blood already on them. But there was no time to dwell. Enemy fire was still coming, and the SEALs had shifted their momentum. No longer pinned down, they pressed forward with lethal precision, covering one another, advancing in bursts. Their confidence was rekindled. Yet behind their determination, there remained a subtle awareness, a sense that the medic among them was no longer just patching wounds. She had become something else. Another figure broke cover high on the ridge. Her scope found him before the SEALs' rifles could swing up. Her breathing slowed, her body sinking into the earth as if merging with it. The crack of her shot was sharp, final. The enemy tumbled backward, limbs flailing. "Target down," she whispered, though no one had asked. A nearby SEAL glanced over, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He gave her the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of trust. That was enough. She didn't need praise. She needed results. Each time she shifted position, she felt the tug of contradiction. Her medic's kit still clung to her side, bandages stained, morphine injectors half spent. She was still ready to crawl to the next casualty, to steady trembling hands and stop the bleeding. Yet she was also more than ready to drop another hostile before they could inflict more damage. It was a balance she had never imagined. She would have to hold, and yet it felt natural, almost inevitable. The SEALs moved forward in a coordinated push, and she followed, sliding from cover to cover, her rifle tucked close. Each time they were threatened from above, she dropped into the dirt, leveled her scope, and answered with fire. Her hands, so steady in surgery, were just as steady here. One round, one breath, one life ended. She was not reckless. She was not wild. Her fury was not fire that burned out of control. It was a blade, sharpened and precise. From the corner of her vision, she caught their looks. Hardened men who had seen countless battles watched her, not with disbelief anymore, but with respect edged in unease. They had expected her to be their guardian with gauze and bandages, not their avenger with a rifle. Yet here she was, carrying both burdens at once. And she carried them well. Hours felt like minutes. The ambush stretched, pockets of resistance flaring and dying across the cliffs. Whenever ACAL took a hit, she was there, sliding to his side, sealing wounds under fire, her calm voice steadying hearts. Whenever the enemy tried to exploit her distraction, she was back behind the scope, silencing them before they could finish their aim. The cycle was brutal, relentless, and it was hers alone to bear. Between bursts of action, she caught fragments of whispered words. "Doc's a damn sniper. Never seen hands like that. She's saving us and killing them." They thought she couldn't hear, but she did. And though she didn't lift her head to answer, part of her wanted to say, "I never wanted this, but I will be whatever you need." By the time the valley began to quiet, the sun was dipping low, shadows stretching long across the rocks. Smoke hung heavy, the smell of gunpowder mingling with dust and blood. The remaining enemy fighters melted back into the cliffs, their assault broken, their confidence shattered. The SEALs regrouped in a shallow depression, dragging the wounded into a circle where she could reach them all. She dropped her rifle beside her without a second thought and tore open her pack once again. Now came the part she knew best. She moved from man to man, her voice low but firm, her hands efficient. She reset tourniquets, started 4 lines, stabilized breathing. She whispered encouragements, grounded them in the middle of exhaustion and pain. They clung to her words as much as to her work. It was only when she paused to wipe the sweat and blood from her face that she noticed their eyes again. Not just gratitude, not just trust. Something heavier. They had witnessed fury in its purest form channeled through the one person they thought least likely to wield it. And it had left an imprint they would never forget. One of the older SEALs broke the silence. "Doc," he said, his voice rough, "from dust and battle, we'll never forget what you did out there." She didn't look up. "I did what I had to." Another voice added, "No, you did more than that." The words hung in the air, unchallenged. She tied off a bandage, checked a pulse, moved to the next man. Inside, her chest was tight, the echo of the rifle still rattling in her bones. She didn't want their reverence. She didn't want to be a legend. She only wanted them alive. But legends are never chosen by the ones who become them. As night fell and the team prepared to exfil, she slung her rifle across her back beside her medic's kit. The dual weight pressed into her shoulders, a reminder of who she had been and who she had become. She didn't know what tomorrow's mission would bring, or how the world outside this valley would judge her transformation. She only knew that today she had saved lives by healing and by ending. And for the SEALs around her, that truth was more than enough. The silence after battle was always the hardest. It wasn't truly silent. There were still groans from the wounded, clinks of spent casings under boots, radios crackling with terse updates, but compared to the storm that had just ripped through the valley, it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the acrid tang of gunpowder clinging to every inhale. She knelt in the dirt, her gloves stiff with blood, moving through the circle of men who had survived. Her rifle rested against her back, forgotten for now. Her hands returned to what they knew best, compressing wounds, checking vitals, whispering reassurances. "Stay with me. You're not done yet. Breathe. Good. Just like that. You'll be home before you know it." The SEALs leaned into her calm as if it were oxygen. No matter what they had seen her do minutes earlier, to them she was. Once again, Doc, the one who kept them alive when the world tried to tear them apart. But beneath that surface calm, she carried the weight of every shot she had fired. Each time her fingers pressed down on a bandage, she remembered the trigger. Beneath them not long ago, each time she looked into a man's eyes and told him he would live, she remembered the eyes in her scope that never would again. The paradox gnawed at her, Yet she kept working. Survival left no time for unraveling. Around her, the SEALs moved. With quiet efficiency, they secured the perimeter, scavenged for intel, confirmed enemy casualties. Normally, their chatter after a firefight carried a sharp edge of adrenaline, the release that came with surviving. This time, it was muted. Their eyes kept drifting toward her. She noticed, though she didn't acknowledge it. One of the younger operators, barely older than 20, crouched nearby holding pressure on his teammate's wound. His gaze flicked from the bandage to her rifle, then back to her face. Paw warred with uncertainty in his eyes. She met his look only briefly, offering a firm nod, and that seemed to steady him. She knew what they were thinking. They had seen fury incarnate, unleashed by someone they thought incapable of it. They had watched the medic become their shield in ways they hadn't imagined possible. And now they struggled to reconcile those two images, the healer and the killer. The truth was, so did she. Ours bled together as the sun dipped below the ridges. Dust turned colder. Shadows stretched long across the valley floor. By the time the extraction bird was inbound, she had stabilized every wounded man, sealed every wound she could, and given each of them at least a fighting chance. When the Black Hawk's rotors finally thundered overhead, she helped load the most critical patients first. Her hands guided litters, secured straps, double-checked 4 lines, even as the wind whipped her hair into her eyes. She moved like a machine, but her chest ached with the weight of exhaustion. As the last casualty was lifted aboard, one of the team leaders grabbed her arm. His face was drawn, streaked with dirt, but his eyes held steady. "You did more than save us today," he said, voice low so only she could hear. She shook her head, already reaching for another patient. "I did my job." "No," he said firmly, gripping tighter. "You did both jobs." The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She pulled free gently, climbed into the bird, and went back to her place beside the wounded. The engines roared, the ground fell away, and the valley disappeared beneath them. For the first time since the ambush began, she allowed herself to breathe. But even as the adrenaline drained, her mind wouldn't let go. She replayed every shot, every pull of the trigger. The clarity she had felt in those moments terrified her. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't faltered. And the precision, it had felt as natural as stopping bleeding or setting a bone. She should have been shaken. She should have been horrified. Instead, she was steady. That steadiness frightened her more than anything else. The helicopter's cabin vibrated with noise, but within it, the SEALs were strangely quiet. Each man sat strapped in, eyes closed or staring into nothing, conserving strength. Yet she could feel their gazes flicking to her, measuring, remembering. Finally, one broke the silence. A grizzled operator with scars tracing down his jaw leaned forward. "Doc," he said, voice cutting through the rotor wash, "we'll never forget what you did back there." His tone carried no judgment, only truth. Others nodded. A murmur spread. Agreement. Respect. Something heavier than gratitude. She looked down at her blood-stained gloves, flexing her fingers. She wanted to tell them she wasn't proud of it, that she hadn't wanted to take lives, that she would give anything for medicine to have been enough. But she didn't speak. Instead, she returned to her patient, adjusted an oxygen mask, and whispered encouragement. Her place, her purpose, was still here, beside the wounded. When the bird touched down at the forward operating base, chaos erupted again, medics rushing in, stretchers rolling, orders shouted. She stayed until every man was offloaded, until every wound was in other capable hands. Only then did she step aside, her body heavy with fatigue. One of the base medics glanced at her rifle still slung across her back. "Didn't know medics carried long guns," he remarked, half curious, half joking. She didn't answer. She simply unclipped the strap, laid the weapon against the wall, and walked toward the debrief room with the SEALs. Inside, under harsh fluorescent lights, the reality settled in. The team sat in silence as the commander ran through the after-action questions. When it came to her, he paused longer than usual. "You held your role under fire?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "You also engaged the enemy?" "Yes, sir." A long silence followed. His eyes studied her, weighing something unspoken. Then he nodded once. Understood. The session moved on, but she could feel the unspoken words in the air. "You're not just a medic anymore." Later, alone in the barracks, she peeled off her blood-soaked uniform. Her reflection in the small mirror stopped her cold. The dirt-streaked face staring back was hers, but the eyes were harder, sharper. The medic was still there, but so was something else, something that had emerged in the valley and refused to disappear. She gripped the sink until her knuckles whitened. "I'm still me," she whispered to her reflection. But in the silence that followed, even she wasn't sure if it was true. Weeks passed after the ambush, but the valley never left her mind. Even in the quiet of the forward operating base, every shadow seemed to stretch long. Every gust of wind carried whispers of the dust and gunfire that had consumed that day. SEALs moved around her, back to routine, drills, exercises, and missions. But the memory of what had occurred lingered, etched into each man's mind. And in each memory, she stood at the center of force that had turned chaos into survival. She continued her work as always, checking vitals, administering medication, monitoring recovery. To outsiders, it seemed nothing had changed. She was still Doc, still the steady hand that kept the team alive. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she felt the weight of what she had become. The rifle rested quietly in the corner of her quarters. Cleaned, oiled, and ready, it no longer seemed alien. It was part of her now, a reminder of the moment she had crossed a line and emerged stronger, more capable than she had imagined. She had taken lives to save lives, and the paradox of that. Reality sat heavily on her shoulders. The SEALs didn't speak much about it, not directly, but their reverence was unmistakable. They would refer to her in casual conversation with a subtle intensity, a quiet acknowledgement of something extraordinary. "We'll never forget her fury," one of the veterans muttered one evening during a debrief, shaking his head slightly. Others nodded, understanding without words. She overheard it sometimes, felt it in the lingering looks, the way they instinctively ensured she was covered during patrols, the subtle trust that went beyond professional reliance. She was no longer just a medic. They relied on her in ways that included lethal force. She was both guardian and weapon, healer and shield, and the men carried that realization silently. In the evenings, when the base quieted and the hum of machinery softened, she found herself alone on the ridge overlooking the training grounds. The sun would dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, and she would think about that day in the valley, the clarity of the moment, the controlled fury, the decisions she had made. It all replayed endlessly in her mind. Her hands would trace the contours of the rifle, almost absent-mindedly, remembering the precise tension of the trigger, the rhythm of breath and aim, the silent judgment in the scope that decided life or death. Each memory carried weight, and yet she felt a strange sense of balance. She hadn't wanted to be a killer, but she had become one for the right reasons. And in doing so, she had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. She thought of the SEALs she had treated and protected, of their trust, their reliance, their quiet awe. She realized that what she had become wasn't an anomaly, was the culmination of years of preparation, training, and restraint. She had always carried the potential within her. The valley had only drawn it out. In time, The story spread quietly within the unit. New members were told of the medic who had become a sniper in moments, of her precision, her courage, her unwavering focus. She was admired, not for the violence, but for her discipline, her ability to channel fury into protection, her capacity to stand between chaos and survival. But she remained humble. The glory, if it could be called that, was not hers. The lives saved, the men still breathing, the missions that continued successfully, those were the true measure of her actions. She cleaned her own wounds silently, washed her uniform without complaint, and returned to her work as she always had, steady and quiet, letting her deeds speak for themselves. Sometimes she would sit with the young operators, teaching them first aid, field medicine, and survival skills. Occasionally, she would let them glimpse her other side, how a sharp eye and a steady hand could neutralize threats, but she never glorified it. She presented it as part of preparedness, part of being ready for anything, part of keeping one another alive. And though the valley was behind her, she carried it forward in every mission, every patrol, every decision. The lessons were burned into her muscle memory, her instincts, her very being. The controlled fury that had emerged in that canyon was no longer an anomaly. It was a part of who she was, silent but present, always ready. Years later, when veterans recounted that mission to others, their voices would carry a mix of respect and disbelief. They would speak of the medic who had saved them, who had healed and killed in the same heartbeat, who had transformed in a way none of them expected. They would say, almost reverently, "We'll never forget her fury." And she, in quiet moments alone, would remember the men, the dust, the gunfire, the choices she had made. She would remember the way she had balanced two roles in a way that few could, and how she had walked through fire without losing herself entirely. She was still Doc. She was still the medic. She was also something more, someone forged in the crucible of combat, tempered by necessity, trusted beyond measure, and feared in a quiet, controlled way by those who would threaten her team. In that balance, she found a strange peace. She did not revel in the violence. She did not seek recognition. She simply existed as she had been forged to exist, capable of saving lives, capable of taking them if necessary, capable of holding steady in chaos. And for those around her, that capability was enough to instill both trust and awe. The SEALs would carry her memory forward, recounting tales of her fury and precision for years to come, teaching new generations about the one who had transformed from medic to sniper in a heartbeat. She had become legend, but not by seeking it. She had become legend by fulfilling her duty, by protecting her brothers, and by refusing to falter when the world demanded more than she thought she could give. In quiet moments, she would stand at the edge of the base, watching the sun rise or set, rifle beside her, kit at her side, and reflect. The duality within her, healer and warrior, was no longer a paradox, but a truth she accepted. She had lived it, embraced it, and emerged stronger. And in that truth, she found a balance that would carry her through every mission yet to come.